Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about the new playoff format that has been thrown out there, a 14-team playoff with a lot of moving parts that I am skeptical will come into fruition, but we'll see what happens there. But now, let's talk about the NCAA president's comments. Charlie Baker had an interesting article that came out where he was talking about possible employment for student athletes. This has become a huge topic of conversation. I think we talked about it earlier this week when talking about the decision between the NCAA and Tennessee, and the NCAA essentially being denied any ability to enforce a lot of their NIL rules. And obviously, this is in direct correlation to that. He had to jump to because a lot of things were happening around him, and the NCAA obviously wanted to be a part of it. So it's very interesting concept. He said he claims that 95% of student athletes would face extinction if contracts became a thing in college sports. This might be true. I'm not I'm no expert on what goes on in all of this type of stuff, but I do think this is kind of a one-dimensional look at things, and not to say there wouldn't be hurdles to get over, and we will get into those hurdles, and there's tons. I won't lie about that, but college sports are one of the few areas in sports in general where we have different sports. We have totally different athletes and totally different needs and all of these different things, but they're treated roughly the same, right? College football is kind of governed the same way as like women's volleyball, but they're two totally different products. They're two totally different games. They're two totally different, ball games in totality. So there is this. I think there's this thought that all of these contracts that are going to be put into place, because I tend to think that's where we're heading. Whether people like it or not, I tend to believe that's really the only way that we're going to be able to have some semblance of understanding around what's going on in college sports. I think it creates like this idea that all of these contracts will be structured the same, will be looked at the same, and I just don't think that's the case. And while there's definitely worries about the smaller non-revenue sports, especially if what's been talked about for a long time, like college football breaking off and becoming its own specific thing, comes to fruition, it leaves a lot of people in tough spots. I mean, only 30 athletic departments in the country turn a profit, and most of them are in the Big Ten and the SEC, and so the vast majority of athletic departments cannot do contracts for their kids, and I think that's probably true in terms of what the normal contract will look like in the SEC and the Big Ten. But these are not going to be the same thing across the board. We talked about it in the last segment. This is a very tiered sport in college football. It's a very tiered system in college sports. So there needs to be at least some type of adjustments that can be made down the line. If you're going from football to basketball to volleyball to softball, it doesn't matter. I think there needs to be some type of different contracts being handed out, and there needs to be some type of different employment strategies, whether that's you're a full-time employee, like say Quinn Ewers at Texas, starting quarterback for Texas, likely going to the NFL after this upcoming season. He would likely be a full-time employee. He probably wouldn't have to worry about class unless he really wanted to, and that would create an interesting dynamic in college sports, but I think that's where we're heading. And then, but if you're talking about, a really good player on the Oklahoma softball team, I think a lot of that could be based off, NIL and incentives and different things that could bring in money to the athletic department, could bring in money to that team, could do different things that would make it viable. So obviously, this is going to be an imperfect system. I think there's very little reality where we are able to implement contracts perfectly and smoothly and it not become a problem somewhere down the road, whether that's a kid getting taken advantage of in their contract disputes, whether that's some sports just not getting nearly as much as the other sports. But I think it's something that has to happen, because at least it'll be a system. It's going to be imperfect. It's going to be a little bit ugly at times, but it's something we can all point at and say, we know the rules of this. We fully understand what is being done here, and we know what the exact parameters are. And it's a very, very complex issue that, frankly, I've been very confused by for quite some time, because there's a lot of stuff going on around it. Baker in December proposed a new tier for Division One, which is kind of what we talked about in the last segment, where it has to be some type of different setup depending on where you are in the pecking order of college sports. But he did say there is a lot of hope from him that Congress will have to get involved if this wants to come to pass. And I'll say this as straightforward as I possibly can: Congress is not going to get involved, at least not in the time frame that he needs them to get involved. Because let's be honest, after the Tennessee ruling, the NCAA is in a really tough spot. They are starting to kind of crumble before our eyes. It's something that people have been talking about for a while, and this might be the moment that kind of starts it tumbling down a hill. But I tend to believe this is kind of on them. And I hate to, you know, throw all the blame on one entity, because obviously there's a ton of people working at this and a ton of people that have created the circumstances we're under now. But at the end of the day, when you look back at particularly the compensation history of college football, for a very long time, there have been people pushing for these college athletes to get paid. There were a number of people like Reggie Bush or Terrell Pryor, or pick a name, that had gotten in trouble for selling or for doing things that were against the rules at that time that now aren't. And basically, the NCAA has been, I don't know, at least 2 or 3 years behind every single one of the steps forward in employment strategy for college athletes. Whether it was back in the day being way behind on the Reggie Bush deal, even earlier being way behind on NIL to where the states had to take over and force their hand, being way late on setting up guidelines for the NIL, so now they're violating antitrust laws by enforcing them. And now they're late to the employment party, because I don't know if you guys have seen this, but there's the unionization effort, at Dartmouth to make themselves employees, all the athletes there, which is a push that is going to happen across the country. If Dartmouth wins this, and there seem to be a lot of people that think Dartmouth has a very good shot of winning it, it's going to be a flash flood. The same way that when Florida or maybe California, one of those two, was the first to pull the trigger on the NIL deals, everyone followed suit. So the thing that the NCAA has not done well for themselves is keep up with the times. They've sat for a really, really long time saying, it's a lot of red tape to get through, and do we really believe that these kids should be paid at that high of a level, and NIL will create all these problems and all these different things that they would tell us. But at the end of the day, all of this stuff could have been figured out. I have no doubts about that. I think all of this stuff was on the table to be figured out if they were 2 years earlier to the party. So the NCAA has kind of created a lot of the problems for themselves and are now trying to play catch up, and it's just not going to work. So I think there is a lot of worry, obviously, with this, because when you look at contracts across college sports, they're going to be different. They're going to have to be different, or you're going to see a lot of non-revenue sports, whether it's women's softball or volleyball or even baseball in some scenarios, turn into club sports, which is obviously not what any of us want. So I think while the contract idea is a new one and it's a very interesting way to go about business, especially in the college ranks where we haven't had to deal with that for the majority of the time. I think it's something that's going to have to happen. I think, period, end of story. It's something that you have to put a structure on what's going on in college athletics. You have to put a structure on all of the different things that are going on around NIL and going on around just money in the sport. You have to put all of this on paper. You have to make sure that all of the parameters are very clear. And right now it's the Wild West. So although it might not be the best step forward, although it might not be totally ideal for the future of the sport, I think it's something that's going to happen. It's something that probably needs to happen, and it's something that the NCAA probably could have been involved in if they were 2 years earlier, 3 years earlier, and just kind of opened their eyes to see what all of the athletes and the coaches and everyone was talking about across the sport. So I'm having a hard time feeling a lot of sympathy for the NCAA here. I do think they will be a part of this somehow, but I think they're going to get cut out of a lot of the bigger sports, especially college football, because college football is totally different than every single other sport in college sports. There's no two ways about that. It brings in the most money, it has the most fans, the kids are the most famous, all of these different things. It's going to be different and it needs to be dealt with differently. And it could have been if the NCAA would just, you know, look around, see what's happening around them, and adjust accordingly. But they were late, and it's created a lot of problems for them. It's created a lot of problems for some athletes in the NCAA, and we'll see what happens with this employment status. We'll see what happens with contracts, but there is definitely some worry across a lot of college sports that people being a little bit late to the party on, compensating college athletes accordingly have created a lot of problems for them. So ton to still happen here, obviously, ton to unpack, and we'll get more concrete details on what all this means going forward. But I have a hard time believing we're not heading towards an employee type setup in college sports. I would be very surprised if that was not the future, and whatever form that takes, it'll be very interesting to see the domino effect of that. But we'll take a little break here, and then when we come back, we're going to talk about some quarterbacks, running backs, and wide receivers. They have reported to Indy the last couple of days. We'll go through workouts this weekend, so we'll break down a couple of guys to watch that are maybe a little bit under the radar. But definitely stick with us, and we will be right back.